Slide 1. Sumas, Land Without Trees by LaVoun Hoffman. From the 60th anniversary edition of the Sumas News, Sumas, Whatcom County, Washington, Thursday, October 27, 1949. Editor's note, Sumas is an Indian word meaning land without trees, and was applied by them to the area immediately northeast of the present town of Sumas, which is bare of trees, although the rest of the country was heavily timbered before the white man came. The town of Sumas got its name from the area which the Indians called Sumas. The following history of the Sumas area and the town of Sumas was written during this past summer by LaVoun Hoffman. A Sumas grade school teacher, she spent months in searching histories, records, and newspapers, and in talking to pioneers for the facts concerning Sumas, and wrote them into an interesting story, which is perhaps the most complete history of Sumas to be compiled. The story was written in connection with the postgraduate work at Western Washington College of Education at Bellingham, where it received a rating of very good. The Sumas News feels deeply indebted to the author for her generosity in compiling our request to publish this story, which we believe will not only be of particular interest to our readers, but should be preserved in printed form for reference in future years. Topic. This is the table of contents. Sumas, Land Without Trees, page 4. Indian abodes open to visitors, page 5. Indians were superstitious, page 6. Pioneers recount incidents, page 8. Homesteaders arrived in 1883, page 9. United States apologies, page 11. Railroads bring boom, page 11. Use oxen in logging, page 12. Loggers struck for good grub, page 14. First banks were failures, page 15. Land donated to railroads, page 17. Shingles were used for money, page 18. Sumas supported 2 hospitals, page 19. Education is promoted, page 20. Incorporation brings post office, page 22. Smuggled Chinese halted, page 23. Lake land reclaimed, page 24. Ordnance muffles cowbells, page 26. Sumas is optimistic, page 27. Sumas pleases Hollanders, page 28. Town buys water system, page 29. Lewis Vale, first fire chief, 31. Fair building is erected, page 32. Roundup Fields Depression, page 34. Covered Wagon Days, page 35. Sumas Cannery, famous, page 37. The Future in Sumas, page 38. Sumas, Land Without Trees by LaVoun Hoffman. The town of Sumas is located 20 miles east of the Tidewater on the northern boundary of the state of Washington. It is near a great plain, the northern part of which is drained by the Fraser and the Sumas rivers, and the southern part by the Nooksack River. This plain is bounded on the west by the low bench of land which extends to the Gulf of Georgia on the north by the Selkirk Mountains, and on the east and south by the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. The most prominent feature of the scenery is lofty Mount Baker, which preside over the lesser mountains and the valley like a true monarch. If it is true, as ethnologists would have us believe, that the Pacific Northwest was original home of the American Indian, it is logical to believe that the area of Sumas has long known the tread of human feet. Situated as it is between 2 rivers and on the edge of a great natural plain from which it takes its name, this would have been the natural place of abode for a settlement of stick Indians, as those who lived away from the water's edge were called. When white men first came to this area, it was populated by Indians belonging to the Nooksack Indian tribe. The spelling of that word is more or less a matter of opinion, as the Handbook of American Indians gives no less than 10 ways of spelling the word. Nooksack is said to be mountain men. This tribe was subdivided into 3 small groups who lived along the river of the same name. They were thought to be separated from the Squamish Indians. The basis for the belief is their speech, which has a dialect very similar to that of the Squamish tribe. Indian abodes open to visitors. These early Indians had a culture all their own, and many of their beliefs and customs are fascinating. If they had an Emily Post, some of their rules of etiquette would have been in direct contrast to those that we observe today. For example, if you were traveling down a stream in your canoe and chanced to meet someone traveling in the opposite direction, it was not considered polite to speak to them until after the boats had met and passed. Then you graciously greeted the person or persons in the other boat and continued to exchange pleasantries as long as you could shout loud enough for the people in the departing boat to hear you. If you were forced to spend the night away from home and found someone's home near your route, you did not wait for an invitation from the owner to enter and make yourself at home. Indian courtesy demanded that your house be open to all guests, so that you did not wait for an invitation. Individual native homes were sometimes constructed with earth walls. A place for a fire was left in the center of the hut and shelves around the edge, covered with mats. Made the beds. The only other household possessions were baskets or kettles for cooking food. Some tribes had longhouses, which were much like the impression the word leaves for community gatherings. One of these longhouses is still in use on the upper Nooksack River. They called the white people Bostons and usually felt honored if they had potlatch to their Boston tillicums. In modern language, they gave to their friend without stint, apparently expecting nothing in return. Some of their clothing was made of mountain goat yarn. The soft wool was rolled against the leg, which had been coated with bear oil until it was smoothed into a long, round strip. This type of yarn was in great demand. Head flattening was a common practice, and not until quite a while after the arrival of the whites was this discontinued. Babies were carried on a board packed in soft moss instead of linen. Indians were superstitious. Medicine men flourished, using noises to drive away the evil spirits from the camp, lest they cause some fearful sickness. If a person did not become ill, the medicine man resorted to weird dances and chants, accompanied by all the noises the village could make. They caught salmon in traps along the streams, removed the skeleton, and hung the fish in drying houses. The backbone of the fish was hung high in the drying house because of the belief that the spirit of the fish dwelled in the backbone, and if the bone were carelessly disposed of, the spirit of the fish might in some manner find its way downstream and warn the other fishes of their fate, if they chose that particular stream for their migration. Since the salmon provided a vital part of the food supply, this would be a great tragedy for the tribe. Bread was made by mixing flour and water into a stiff dough, forming it into a flattened ball and baking it in the hot ashes. There is a marked difference of opinion as to the temperament of these Indians. Mrs. Judson says they were polite and respectful, and she never felt fear of them. In direct contrast, the late O.D. Post was quoted as saying, "The Indians were as wild and furious as they make them." Since Mr. Post was present in the community when an Indian murdered a white man and was lynched in return, he may have had this impression of the tribe a bit. Colored by his unfortunate incident, it seems to be the general consensus of opinion that as a whole the tribes were peaceful and friendly, although in every group of people, no matter to what race they belonged, you will find those having undesirable characteristics. The coming of the white man, who had superior weapons and craftier minds, brought the Indian much trouble, new diseases, and gradual evacuation. In 1906, the Nooksacks were officially enumerated, and the report says there were 200 of the tribe remaining. However, Hill Tout says there were only about 6 true male Nooksacks. They now live on a reservation south of the city of Everson. As the years go by and the old members of the tribe die off, the younger members seek their own ways, adopt modern customs, and intermarry with other races. They are gradually being absorbed by their surroundings, and this may lead someday to extinction. Pioneers recount incidents to gain a better picture of Sumas as the early settlers knew it. I would like to quote some of the old-timers in 1932. The Sumas News ran a series of interviews with those who were qualified to tell the early history of the settlement. One of these was Fraser York, the first white child born on the mainland of British Columbia. His parents came to this region in 1865, and the son born shortly after they arrived was named to honor the river near their new home. Mr. York said Robert Johnson, father of Archie Johnson of Sumas, and Martin were the first settlers where Sumas now is. Next came John Hinchy, who homesteaded the Thalheimer place. Gerald Lockwood located the Noble place. That year, at the close of the Civil War, found only one settler between here and Old Whatcom. His name was Hampton, and he operated a ferry across the Nooksack below the present site of Everson. He used a shovel-nosed canoe, especially designed to buck the current. Our riding horses would lead behind the canoe. Hampton was drowned when his canoe struck a snag and was split from stem to stern. Linden had only 2 settlers. Their names were Judson and Hawley. The entire country, certainly, was a wilderness in those days. The old 1858 trail was the only means of traveling to Old Whatcom. This was the trail followed by the Caribou miners, placer mines on Fraser, and crossed the Sumas River 4 times between Sumas and Nooksack. Crossing rivers in those days meant something. Bridges were unknown, and the crossing was made by means of going over on felled trees. They lay across the stream and were flattened slightly on the top to form a walking surface. The saddle horses were all trained to walk on logs. It was some sight to see them step gently across the logs. Once in a while, a stranger's horse would fall off, but the trained animals rarely slipped. Homesteaders arrived in 1883. Mr. York also recalled the story of the lynching, which I shall relate later, and stated that he saved the barrel of the gun which the Indian used. He said it was badly battered by someone in the party who banged it against a tree. Mr. Bell's widow remarried a man named Simpson. Another comer was O.D. Post. Way back in 1883, Mr. Post, I settled in this rich land section with the late M.W. Rogers, my stepfather. He was among a group of 8 to 10 families who migrated into this country that year. The previous year they had surveyed the region and made arrangements for my homesteading. Some of the other settlers recalled by Mr. Post were Mr. and Mrs. Smith, M.J. Steele, O.E. Noble, Peter Sarr, and John Sarr. How well I recall the hardships we went through after taking up our homesteads in the early 80s. The country was nothing but a wilderness. Besides the water travel, the Caribou Trail was the only means of communication with the outside world. The trail connected Puget Sound with British Columbia. Quite a contrast is in the paved highway of today with that muddy or dusty trail that wound through the forest and underbrush, going around most every tree or bump in the way. The nearest trading post was at Nooksack Crossing, located about 8 miles from here. By the road, those days, the distance was nearly 15 miles. Settlers carried supplies on their backs. There were practically no horses and only a few oxen available. Nooksack Crossing was the center of an Indian murder and robbery that made quite a stir around here. An Indian named Louis Sam from across the line had been hanging around the trading post for some time. Finally, he decided he'd like to have some of the provisions and the equipment in the store. So he broke through the barriers, went into the store, murdered the storekeeper, whose name was Bell, and headed across the border. Immediately, a posse of settlers formed, and with their crude frontier muskets and firearms, made off to get the native. They found him asleep in his wigwam and brought him back to the line, where he was lynched by hanging to a tree. I believe there is some sort of marker there to this day. United States apologizes. The posse had broken up quickly, and it was almost impossible to place one's finger on any single guilty person. Nevertheless, the protests on the part of the government across the line necessitated action on the part of our governmental agency here. So to technically meet the request of the neighboring Commonwealth, a young fellow without family took the entire responsibility and entered an official plea of guilty to the legal charges. He was sentenced to serve a few months in the county jail and then at the county seat of Whatcom. He had been a fellow who didn't object to residing in jail anyway because he was unemployed and had no family problems of his own. What it really amounted to was an official apology. The original application of the name Sumas referred to Sumas Prairie, a good-sized tract of land in British Columbia. It was an area of 30,000 acres without trees. 40 years ago, a swamp was located between the present site of the City Hall and the news office. Today is the same tract forms the hard surface Main Street and business center of a trade area of several thousand inhabitants. Railroads bring boom. Railroad construction began in the late 80s. My recollections are that the surveys for the rights were the first made in 1887. With the completion of these lines, Sumas began a boom that lasted until everything was suddenly stopped by the hard times of 1893. And take it from me, those were sure hard times. Hard times were greater then because modern comforts were unknown and people lived next to nature. Things dragged along for several years after Sumas experienced its first depression. Years and years seemed to go by, and we thought conditions would never readjust themselves. Finally, the turning point was reached, and the upshot started along about 1898. Logging and lumbering operations boosted this growth for a period of 2 decades. At one time, 10 mills were in operation here. During 1909, while I was serving as postmaster, I made a population census. I estimated that 2,500 people reside immediately in Sumas and the suburbs. A true frontier setting characterized the picturesque setting in those days. We had quite a tent city. At one time, the numerous gambling dens reminded one of a little Monte Carlo. With the completion of the logging operations, the next logical step in the natural evolution of the community was the agricultural phase. Dairying and the other forms of agriculture are rapidly developing. Concerning the logging, which was responsible for the great rapid growth, the late George Gillies had this to say: use oxen in logging. In 1887, we started our saw and shingle mill. We started on a small scale and gradually developed it into a large enterprise. The family worked the mill at first, and gradually the thing developed until at one time we had as many as 50 employed. Over a period of years, we kept buying more and more timberland and expanding our operations. A large part of our products were sold right here in Sumas. Among the earliest implements for sawing in the mill was the crude old muley saw. Finally, the circular saw was installed, and still later the double circular for mill operations. The resaw planer and other devices were finally put to use. Logging operations were first carried on by oxen over skid roads. The horses soon replaced the crude methods, and then came the donkey engine and the railroads. Mr. Gillies recalled that in 1883 a great flood covered the whole valley. It was caused by a heavy snow, followed by a heavy rain. He also explained that the last century saw more rain and snow than the present one. This accounts for the fact that the Nooksack River was once large enough for steamboats to travel upon. In the early 80s, a 4-horse team and wagon made the trip to Nooksack every other day to bring mail and supplies. From there, the mail was taken to Linden, Ponyback. Mr. Gillies said, "Not many of us kids had schooling compared with what kids get now. My brother John had some schooling after we came here, but not I. Most of us were too busy trying to make a living and survive in the struggle for existence. As far as available recreation, there were the church gatherings and a few dances, but nothing to speak of in the modern sense of the word." The skid roads of which Mr. Gillies spoke were constructed by laying small logs crossways from 6 to 8 feet apart. The logs were barked on one side and slightly flattened to make sliding possible. A skid greaser went ahead to make the skids easy for pulling the heavy timbers. After horses were proven safe for pulling, they were used. At first it was feared that the horses would be too fast to be practical. Not until the advent of the donkey engine and the high lead was it possible to log the steep slopes. Loggers struck for good grub. The lumbermen brought most of their living apparel, which was usually quite simple, with them, and they furnished their own blankets, and the mill furnished enough hay or straw for bedding in the bunkhouses. The cookhouse was an important part of the institution and contained the necessary equipment to feed the loggers, thus keeping them happy, or otherwise. Willard Gaskill, who came to this area in 1892, said, "There are all kinds of cookhouses and all kinds of cooks." This caused many a strike among the crews. During the summer of 1894, there was a big forest fire. It was quite serious and was undoubtedly started by some camp which was burning off the underbrush, a common practice in the preparation for logging. For many days it was impossible to see the hills for the smoke. Many families lost their homes and possessions, and many of the plank roads and bridges were destroyed. A very important citizen of this community was the late Russ S. Lambert. He had this to say: "I came here a long time ago. It was back in November of the year 1890, when I came here from Belvidere, Illinois, as a young attorney. My first official act was that of officially incorporating the city of Sumas. My records show that it was incorporated May 4, 1891. 72 persons signed the original petition asking county commissioners to incorporate the city. Of course, the petition was immediately granted by the county governing body. William Sharp was the first mayor of the village. 5 councilmen served with him. The article goes on to name the other mayors of the city: H. Swayze, S.P. Connor, Edgar Teambell, O.Y. Everly, Dr. E.S. Clark, R.S. Lambert, Thomas Brown, Jackson Wells, James Myers, George Dunlap, making the list complete up to 1932. The names of the 72 original signers of the petition are given in this interview, which can be found in the Sumas News, June 16, 1932. First banks were failures. Relative to the banking situation, Mr. Lambert recalled the formation of the first bank in the community. "We had a great deal of trouble over the first financial center in those early days. Back in the 1893, there wasn't a single bank in the area outside the one that the county seat, as I recall it. Other sources say that there were 2 banks, attempted. 1891, the year the town was incorporated, but both of these failed within a year. The Garrison brothers opened a bank in 1902. A rival bank opened in 1914. It was advertised as the Sumas State Bank. General banking business, W.S. Wells, cashier. This state bank was bought out by the Garrison Brothers Bank in 1916. During the Depression, this bank, along with many others, failed. After a reorganization, the Bank of Sumas has existed to this day and seems to be going strong. The manager, vice president, is J.W. Langley, and several prominent citizens are on the board of directors. Mr. Lambert recalled how a particular problem arose that resulted in the formation of a cemetery corporation. Upon finding the body of a suicide victim in the downtown streets in the early days, a group had to get together and haul the corpse in a wagon to Nooksack for interment. Right then and there, we decided to form a cemetery, so I prepared the proper papers while the rest of the fellows set aside the tract of land for the purpose. The cemetery later fell into the hands of the local Oddfellows Lodge. This cemetery is located south and a little east of Sumas on a road appropriately named Graveyard Road. Another cemetery, which used by the people in this vicinity, is on the Clearbrook area on the eastern end of Pangbourne Lake. There is also a small Catholic cemetery. Land donated to railroads. Going back to the chronology of the city, it was in 1889 that 2 railways sought rights of way through the settlement. A. Johnson gave the Seattle, Lakeshore, and Eastern, later the Northern Pacific, 10 acres of land, and the Bellingham and British Columbia, now the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul, 20 acres. The first rail station was on the site of the old Miller Shingle Mill, where the highway now crosses the creek. The next year, a stranger came along, looked the place over, and saw great business possibilities. He proceeded to construct a saloon near the station. It must have been a successful venture, for before long 9 other people followed the leader, and he had a like number of saloons. The original town site was plotted to align with the first railroad station and the first saloon. Incidentally, the name of the man he honored was establishing the first business building in Sumas was Buckwoods. The first grocery and general merchandise store was opened in 1890. It was operated by William S. Sharp. 1890 and 1891 were prosperous years for the infant city, and it grew with an amazing rate of speed. The population increased to about 1,000 during those 2 years, and money seemed to grow on trees. The saloons had plenty of liquor, and gambling was a seemingly popular diversion. Other businesses which developed were Patch and Fuller's General Merchandise, Garrison Brothers Drugs, C.H. Mott's Dry Goods, Peter West's Grocery, A. Shoemaker's Grocery, Jake Strauss Larson Brothers Bakery, J.R. Smith's Hotel, and others. The town had 2 lawyers, R.S. Lambert and Phil A. Lawrence. R.H. Post and a man named Lloyd served the town as physicians. 2 churches, the Methodist and the Baptist, were established. The date of the organization of the Baptist Church is 1891, and the membership was 10. Later, the Baptists, Methodists, Episcopals, and Presbyterian formed a federated church and held combined worship services in the Methodist building. In time, the Methodist organization absorbed the others, and it remains to this day. Shingles were used for money. In 1892, a slump was noticed, and in the 1893 hard times really hit the young city. The shingle mill went into the hands of receivers, and logging camps closed. All building stopped, and business virtually ceased. The people who had put all their money into developing their homesteads were almost destitute, for they were not well enough established to take care of themselves, and no industry was offering jobs for financial aid. Those who could leave their families went to the LaConner Flats for the harvest season. Those who could not leave their families worked on the roads for the county. The county paid them $1 a day and allowed them $1 a day on their taxes. Farm produce was traded for the necessary store groceries. The salmon run was a great gift to the people that year in the Goshen community. Shingles were used for legal tender. It was a strange and fearful contrast to the prosperity of a couple years back. Many of the people left the country and the population decreased about 50%. The closing of the 2 small banks brought more hardship to the people who had entrusted them with their money. According to Robert Johnson, it took about 10 years for the town to recover and business to return to its former pace. Progress was showing in 1902. Cherry Street, which was little more than a cow path, was opened and developed. The main street before that time had been Railroad Avenue, but businesses began to move a block east to the new section of town. The 3-story Mount Baker Hotel was moved from its original location in the southeast section of town to the corner of Cherry and Garfield Streets. It did a much better business there, but I'm afraid it was never as flourishing as the builder had anticipated. Sumas supported 2 hospitals. The first hospital in Sumas came around this time. It was built by a Dr. Dalton and was located west of the Gillies' home. There was a hospital there now, although it was recently ceased, admitting patients for hospitalization and is being used as a clinic. The doctor in charge at the present time is E.S. Sarvis. For a while, Sumas boasted of 2 hospitals. The other is located a block east of Cherry Street and just north of the creek. It was built by Dr. Clark in 1911. At that time, it was described as being very modern, with all the latest equipment. This building was later used by Dr. Nugent as a hospital. After he closed it, it was idle for a few years, and then the Christian Reformed Church, desiring a denominational school for their children, bought the building, remodeled it to contain several schoolrooms and living apartments for the principal, and opened school there in the fall of 1945. The first school in this vicinity was at Jarrah, about 2 miles south of the present town. It also served as a post office before Sumas was officially created. Before 1891, the children attended school in a log cabin. The teacher was Edward Hopkins. L.G. Van Valkenburg owned a 2-story building in which he operated a store. In 1891, he offered the upper story of the building to the school board to be used as a classroom. It was also used as a community center, and Van's Hall, as it came to be called, was the center of social activities for several years. Education is promoted. Mr. Van Valkenburg remained on the school board for some 20 years. His building was later sold to the Catholics to use it for a church. In 1892, a school building was erected in Sumas. By 1900, an addition had been made to the building so that it housed both the grade school and the high school. In 1905, a separate concrete block structure was built for the primary grades. There were 13 teachers in the double building and 5 in the primary building that year. The original building was an impressive 2-story wooden structure with a prominent bell tower. I have been told the bell from that school is now in the bell tower of the Christian Reformed Church here in Sumas. The present public school building was erected during the middle 30s. It's a long, low, 1-story building. The original building containing 8 classrooms, an office, a small library, and the necessary storerooms and sanitary facilities. In 1936, the Liberty District consolidated with Sumas. In July 1937, a $10,000 gymnasium was started. It utilized lumber from a small gym on the school grounds and material from an old gym located near Gargett's store, which the town had donated to the school district. Work on this new project was suspended during hard times, then resumed in 1939 with the PTA and Lions Club furnishing the materials and the WPA, Work Projects Administration, supplying the labor. In the fall of 1942, this addition to the school was completely destroyed by fire, and the rest of the building escaped by a narrow margin. In 1944, construction on a new gym was started, and the addition included 2 classrooms, a cafeteria stage, dressing rooms, and a storage and shower rooms. Incorporation brings post office. Reorganization of school districts in 1941 was responsible for the combining of Sumas, Nooksack, Everson, Clearbrook, Glen Echo, and portions of Roeder, Forest Grove, Goshen, Hopewell, Kendall, and Columbia Valley districts into one large unit, which was given the name Nooksack Valley District, number 506. At the present time, there are 2 grade school buildings, and one in Sumas, and a new one between Everson and Nooksack, and the common high school is located halfway between Sumas and Nooksack on the Sumas-Blaine Highway. As I stated before, the first post office was located at Jarrah and was under the administration of Mr. Noble. After the incorporation of the city, a post office was located in town. It was south of the creek on Columbia Street. Later, the post office was moved up to Cherry Street, a more central location. In December of 1936, a fire destroyed the post office, and it was temporarily, they thought, moved into the Shoemaker Building. The federal authorities were asked to make a new appointment as the old lease was almost expired. This they agreed to. In the summary of the year's events for 1937 in the news, each month's summary ends with these words, and the federal authorities promised immediate action on the location of the post office. Finally, in 1938, the news editor published an open letter to the congressman and sent a copy to that person. Immediately came an apology. The explanation that he thought the matter had been settled months before, and with a month the post office was moved to its present location on the west side of the Cherry Street. Smuggled Chinese halted. Since Sumas is a border town, the Customs and Immigration Service must necessarily be included in this story. The Customs was established before the Immigration Service. Sumas was a Chinese port of entry, and in 1903 a Chinese detention station was established on a hill back of the Northern Pacific Railway. It was near the rail line because at that time all traffic across the line was by rail. The Customs at the time had a small office back of the present hotel, Sumas. There was much smuggling in those days, and many an honest officer must have been sorely tempted to accept some of the oriental silks or precious dope if they would momentarily have an accidental deaf or blind spell. One man, known as Redmond, was known to be in the human smuggling business. He issued false passports to the immigrants. Since Oriental ways are different from ours, it must have caused much neck-stretching and wonderment when an interpreter brought his Chinese bride here to make her home. Around 1912, both the Customs and the Immigration Service moved into the building on the border, which is now occupied by the Sumas Dairy Products Company. The present building used by these services was completed in October of 1932. It is a modified Dutch colonial design, 2 stories high, and includes 8 office rooms, 2 cells, shower baths, and restrooms. The office here has always been fairly busy. In 1914, Sumas stood fourth in customs receipts, being surpassed only by Seattle, Tacoma, and Spokane. They have not always maintained that standing, but a lively business is found on any day. Beginning June 1, 1949, the port here is remaining open 24 hours a day instead of only 16 as it has been for the past few years. Many Canadians come to Sumas for liquid refreshment as well as for general shopping. When the American sugar ration ended, the Canadians were still on short rations. Each family was allowed to take 10 pounds across the line to Canada. Canadians drove over 50 miles to take advantage of this offer, and who could prove just who belonged to which family? Sumas enjoyed a sugar parade, and tons of sugar crossed the line in a short time. Lake land reclaimed. The draining of Sumas Lake was important to this area. The lake covered approximately 12,000 acres of land. When the rainy season arrived, it was shallow in most places, the deepest place being about 10 feet deep. It was a paradise for ducks and good fishing too. Many Indian arrowheads were found in certain areas when the lake was drained. This project involved building about 18 miles of dike, varying from 6 to 15 feet in height, and changing the course of two rivers, the Sumas and the Vedder. The Vedder Canal carries the bulk of the water away from the area, and a pumping plant forces the water into the Fraser River. The old lake bed was proven to be very fertile, and good crops are grown there, including hops. At one time, there was a 600-acre patch of hops in the area. In going through the files of the Sumas News, I have found so many interesting items it's hard to sift them out. To gain an idea of the building boom, here are some articles from the 1910 issues. The Baptist Church was dedicated in February. A motion picture house was doing good business with admissions set at 10 cents and 20 cents. In March, George Parkinson announced that he would build a concrete block building as a place of business. It was to measure 65 by 112 feet. By the next week, this project had developed into a hotel, and the dimensions were enlarged to 100 by 160 feet. 4 miles out of town, Joe Morrison, Otis McGowan, and Pete Cleary were working in a lumber camp. They had just made a trip into town and provided themselves with a 40-pound hunk of bacon. A sudden commotion was heard, and they looked out to see a cougar carrying off their meat supply. They rushed to the attack, armed with an axe, a butcher knife, and a corkscrew. After treeing the beast, they cut down the tree, and as the cougar fell, Joe grabbed him by the tail. Apparently the cougar had had enough because he dropped the bacon and fled, minus a portion of his tail. Ordnance muffles cowbells. That was also the year of the bicycle ordinance. Politics today are no rougher than at that time, for the paper carried some other sarcastic and critical columns concerning the governing body of the town. The first class to complete 4 years of high school in Sumas had graduated that year. John Henchy, who came to this valley about 1860, died. H. Symes, the town marshal, captured an escaped convict named R.H. Thielman, who was a member of the notorious Moy Bray gang. For this feat, he collected a reward of $100. The Swale Hotel was started and a fire company organized. The city passed an ordinance stating that all persons owning cows must remove the bells while the cows were in the city limits. Anyone disobeying this order was to be arrested and prosecuted. In July, the BC Interurban reached Sumas, making a total of 6 railroads here. Sumas was described as a rail center. Since all the available property was occupied, it was necessary in 1910 to open a new addition. 60 acres, known as the Old Eaton Place, located south of town and partially cleared, were annexed and offered for sale. The Seattle Brewing Company bought 40 acres, and the WCTU, Women's Christian Temperance Union, was horrified at the thought of having a brewery right in town. R.L. Smith started a creamery. The October 8th issue lists 11 businesses, concerns which had changed hands, moved to larger quarters, or opened business in the previous month. Sumas is optimistic. In the face of all this progress was a notice for the Grange members to meet at a certain home for the purpose of closing the business, as the Grange was dissolving. In December was a large picture of the town with big headlines to this effect: "Set your stakes in Sumas soon. Only wet town in Whatcom County, Washington. Destined to become an important railroad center. 5 roads are listed with assurance. If you live in Sumas, you are in touch with the world. The spread ended with this statement: there'll be something doing in Sumas, AD 1911, and there was. The limestone quarry in Columbia Valley, with the finest ledge of limestone in the world, began operations. People were invited to invest in a low-grade gold mine on Sumas Mountain, which was developed on a large scale. The Grand Hotel opened. Cherry Street was paved with lime rock. Oriental silks were selling in the stores for 50 cents a yard, and rice and beans were 5 cents per pound. Railroad freight was shipped directly to Sumas and redistributed to Bellingham and surrounding points. The local doctor published a shocking article stating the danger of improper sewage disposal, and the town decided it must have sewers. Mayor Tom Brown, who had learned brickmaking in England, was walking along the railroad when he saw some interesting clay. He called in an authority and returned a glowing report for the possibilities of a fire brick plant. One was to be built immediately. Dr. Clark's hospital was complete. The Canadian Power Company built a $100,000 power station in Huntington to bring juice from Stave Lake. A line was to be extended to Bellingham. Since there were no funds in the state treasury for the financing of roads, each man was asked to give on a 10-hour day toward the repair and construction of roads. The Sumas Chamber of Commerce boosted its project and was accomplished on the roads surrounding Sumas. Sumas pleases Hollanders. Saturday was lively day. 18 farm rigs and 7 automobiles were counted in town. In May, 3 Hollanders arrived. There were an advanced guard sent by their countrymen to look the place over to see if it was suitable for settlement. They decided favorably and asked for a grant on land on which to build a church. The community was anxious to have these new citizens and granted the request. A shoe manufacturing company began. Operations and a woman's club was organized. Sumas was soundly denounced by a pastor in Bellingham, and a local pastor retaliated with a rebuttal. Rail excursions were held to Vancouver and Glacier. The trail to Mount Baker was surveyed, and the city brought 10 acres for a park site. The Lost Fortune mine was shipping silver ore to Tacoma. 25 pack horses brought the ore into Sumas. The telephone system was reorganized. After looking over these early papers, I am firmly convinced that it definitely is not the fault of the paper that Sumas did not grow to New York's proportions. In 1913, bold headlines were announcing Sumas high and dry for the first time in history. The new sewer system was paying off, and Sumas was going through fall rains without being practically inundated. Also, citizens were walking on sidewalks and making favorable comments when comparing them with the muddy paths of yore. The Sumas Steam Laundry installed $10,000 worth of equipment here. L.E. Blondin had purchased a little land near Clearbrook and was conducting some digging. At first he told people he was digging a well. After people had decided he must be crazy to put so much money, time, and effort into a dry hole, it was discovered that he had a mine which was reported to have gold pearls and rubies and a gravel bed 40 feet down. Town buys water system. In 1914, the water company connected with an apparently inexhaustible supply of spring water. The Sumas Water Company had been established in 1909. It was originally incorporated for $10,000, but was increased to several times that amount now. The spring, which was the source of the city water, is approximately 4,500 feet west of the Sumas News Office. By the means of a pump, the water is carried up to a reservoir on Parkinson's Hill. This large concrete reservoir has a capacity of 355,550 gallons. The town of Sumas purchased the water system in 1943 and now operates it. Also in 1914, an auto stage line making 2 regular trips to Bellingham daily, with a 2-ton capacity Kelly truck, offered the use of its facilities to passengers. R.T. Johnson was postmaster, and a rural route was established. In June of 1914, fire destroyed the Grand Central Hotel, the oldest hotel in Sumas. An airplane came to Sumas as part of the 4th of July celebration, which was so great an occasion that the Bellingham and Anacortes canceled their celebrations to come to Sumas. It seemed for a while that Sumas was going to be a great metropolis. Instead, a later depression started in downhill, and it rolled almost to the bottom. They say you can't keep a good man down. Perhaps the same goes for cities. Anyway, there came another period of building. The old landmarks were rapidly disappearing. In 1931, the old bandstand was razed. It stood between Tudor and Lynn's store and the Parkinson building. At one time, a racetrack circled through the south of town. The need of more buildings abolished the track, and as they developed, the main road took shape, and the bandstand was built on the thoroughfare in the 1880s. Lewis Vale, first fire chief. The official Sumas Volunteer Fire Department was organized in November of 1936. Sumas had fire departments before, but this was thought to be an improvement. It was to have not less than 6, nor more than 12 members. The chief and his assistant were appointed by the mayor, and the firemen were selected by the fire chief. For their services, they received $1 for each call, with an additional 50 cents for each hour after the first. Payment for clothing ruined at the fire is provided. Lewis Vale was the first fire chief. A new truck, which threw water and the length of the block and as high as any building in town, was purchased. This one had a 500-gallon booster tank, 400 feet of large hose, several nozzles, one 24-foot ladder and one 12-foot ladder. The creamery now in existence was reorganized in 1941. It is known as the Sumas Dairy Products Company and is managed by Peter Ellenboss. At the time of its opening, it could handle from 40,000 to 50,000 pounds of milk daily. There is a 1,500-pound capacity churn, pasteurizers totaling 900-gallon capacity, and a separator which will handle 7,000 pounds of milk per hour. Powdered milk and casein were also manufactured. One of the most interesting chapters in the history of Sumas is the story of the Roundup. For a number of years, Sumas had a small agricultural fair and stock exhibit. Vegetable, flower, and fancy work displays were placed in some vacant building, and the stock displays were placed in an old livery barn. Fair building is erected. This did not prove satisfactory, so the town was canvassed for subscriptions. A field day was arranged, and a very substantial building was on what was called the town park property. In 1922, it was decided to add a few sporting events, and a couple bucking horses were secured, as well as 2 or 3 steers for bareback riding. In addition to this, a few local ponies were secured for a race or two over an uneven dirt track between the stumps. In 1923, the fair building burned to the ground, and Sumas was at a loss to know just what to do for the annual event. A few cowboys and ranchers from the upper BC country had been staging a bucking contest in Vancouver and had some of their horses across the line on a short distance from Sumas. They made an offer to put on an exhibition for a sum that looked very large, but after considerable consideration, it was decided to engage them by using what horses and riders they had, picking up some local ponies and riders and a steer here and a cow there. The show was started with a bang. A road show happened to be in town, and this troupe, assisted by local talent as clowns, helped to pull the show over the week's places, and the venture was successful beyond all hopes. The attendance for the 2 days was over 5,000 paid admissions, besides almost as many who forgot to buy tickets, as the ground was fenced only on 2 sides. This added to the courage of the promoters. And the Sumas Roundup Association was formed. About 80 citizens joined the organization and signed up to help finance it to a certain amount. Improvements such as grandstand, barns, fences, clearing and grading a track and the arena were gotten under the way by spring of 1924, and a 3-day roundup was decided to be held so as to include Labor Day. The grandstand had a seating capacity of 6,500, with bleachers to seat an additional 2,500 people. A roundup hall was built to provide a place to hold dances during the roundups. Altogether, over $25,000 was invested in the venture. The success of the 1924 show was remarkable, with about 25,000 people passing through the gates in the 3 days, and over 5,000 paid out in prize money alone. The following year, about 35,000 people saw the show, and in succeeding years, until 1929, the shows were equally successful. The town literally overflowed, and the paper appealed to all homeowners who had extra rooms to let it be known that the out-of-towners might be accommodated. Roundup feels depression. Then came the Depression, and conditions were such that it was felt the roundup could not be put on as successfully as it had in the past, so it was decided to discontinue it. During the years when the show was not held, the idea of eventually resuming was kept alive by a local and enthusiastic group of local residents. Finally, in 1937, the Roundup Arena was leased to John E. Hartwig, with the understanding that he was to arrange and manage the show. He was filled with enthusiasm and imported bucking horses, wildest Brahma bulls, and Texas Longhorn steers. He scheduled games of horsemanship, saddle horse races, horseback quadrilles, and individual fancy riding and roping. An invitation to attend the festivities was sent to President Roosevelt, and he graciously replied that he would certainly attend, providing he made a trip to the West during that season. The Sumas News did its share to publicize the events. The issue for September 23, 1937, there is a front-page dictionary of roundup terms and lists of regulations and rules of the various contests. Almost the entire front page and parts of pages 2, 5, 6 are devoted to roundup stories. Before the great day, a few difficulties were encountered. One of these resulted from a bit of carelessness and brought on a court suit concerning the granting of concessions. The other trouble was a slight run-in with the Humane Society, who contended that calf roping was not the most pleasant diversion for a young calf, and requested that the part of the program be cancelled. Hartwig politely replied that only experts took part in this phase of the game, and that they were so well experienced that they could rope a calf with a minimum of discomfort to the small creature. Covered Wagon Day. The great day dawned, cool and dripping, very wet rain. But in spite of this inconvenience, 8,000 people attended the exhibition. Mr. Hartwig was a town hero. Pride goeth before a fall, they say, and in that case maybe it was inevitable that there be more difficulty. In March of 1938, action was filed against Mr. Hartwig because he did not post the required bond. The defendant reproached his good neighbors and reminded them that he had brought this family here to reside and would be planning any dirty work if this were his hometown. He must have been convincing, because the suit was withdrawn, and at least part of the Hartwig's prestige was restored to him. Mr. Hartwig managed the 1938 show also. There were afternoon and evening shows on July the 3rd and 4th. Feature attractions were Little Hank Keenan, a 12-year-old cowboy movie star, and 8-year-old Lois Jean Junquist and her educated pony for Edison. In addition to this, there was an assortment of star cowboys and cowgirls, and the inauguration of a colorful pageant entitled Cover Wagon Days. Following that show, Mr. Hartwig departed our fair city, whether voluntarily or otherwise I have not been able to determine. A Miss Rose Wall was employed as manager in 1939. Floodlights were installed in the field that year, and although only 5,000 attended the roundup, it was declared successful from both financial and entertainment standpoint. In 1940, the Sumas Roundup became a member of the Rodeo Association of America, thus making points earned by cowboys count toward the World Championship. The advantage of this was the attraction of much greater talent. Due to the international difficulties, Canada imposed restrictions of traffic beginning a few months before the rodeo. This was a severe check on Canadian customers, but there were close to 5,000 in attendance anyway. That was the last year of the Sumas Roundup. For financial reasons and because of the war stress, they were discontinued. The grandstand was offered for sale by the city in 1944 and was bought by Virgil M. Hoffman, who deconstructed it using the materials for the framework of the house in which he now lives, and selling quantities of it to be used in various types of buildings over the country. The Roundup Hall is now known as the skating rink, and the roller skating is held on regular schedule. About the time the close of the rodeo, auto races were held on the Roundup grounds. Now the main attraction here is fastball, and almost every suitable summer evening see strong competition between various local organizations. The Rod and Gun Club also uses the field for its shoots. Sumas Canary famous. In other ways, Sumas has gained a place in the papers and magazines of the nation. This sensation was Mickey, a talking canary owned by Mrs. Sylvia Hopkins. Mickey began talking when he was about 1 year old, adding words until he used 16 different words correctly arranged in statements or questions. There was a distinct inflection in his speech. He was heard in several coast cities, including a 3-day exhibit at a leading department store in Seattle and Tacoma in 1933. Only 3 birds have been known to talk, and of them, Mickey had the largest vocabulary. The Vanderbilt University of Tennessee and other educational institutions have records of this unique bird. Mickey had a companion named Bob, who attracted his share of attention by whistling Yankee Doodle. During Mickey's last couple of years, he talked less and less until he died on August 4, 1938. So much for the past of Sumas. As to the present, we have a fair shopping district, including 5 grocery stores, 2 drugstores, 2 hotels, 6 service stations, 1 bank, 2 schools, 7 churches, 3 doctors, 1 dry cleaning establishment, a beauty shop, meat market, mercantile, dairy plant, furniture store, hardware store, mortuary, welding shop, jewelry store, printing office, lumber yard, second-hand store, plumbing shop, theater, 2 barber shops, roller rink, woodworking shop, sporting goods store, 2 feed mills, 2 custom brokers, and an assortment of cafes and taverns. There has been a housing problem here as everywhere else, but the building is progressing nicely. The city park is being improved, and the old city park, including concrete, tennis courts, and floodlights, is maintained. Many of the vacant lots around the town are being taken over by some organization and transformed into beauty spots instead of eyesores. There is a group of lodges and fraternal orders, as well as various types of clubs, so there is no lack of social opportunity. The future in Sumas. Looking to the future, Sumas stands a good chance of still further improvement. The international highway, which has been proposed from Bothell to Sumas to connect with the Canadian highway, has been under discussion since 1937, but prospects are better now than ever. The 24-hour opening of the border will help the tourist trade, of which we enjoy an ample amount since Sumas is on the route to the Cariboo. There is a rumor that the railroad is considering large yards here in the not-too-distant future. The lumbering may be mostly history, but a small shingle mill has been opened in Sumas and is making steady progress. The limestone quarry is a steady project, and a lime crusher has recently been installed here in town. The clay mine, although less glamorous than the gold and rubies that excited earlier settlers, is a steady concern. Dairying and small fruit raising are prominent now and will continue to be for years to come, unless some drastic feat of nature intervenes. Sumas is a small town. It is border town, and it may have its faults, but did you ever see a place large or small which everyone agreed was the place to be? As for me, I have enjoyed living and working in this area, and to my knowledge shall stay here for some time to come. The end. Mrs. Hoffman on the Sumas School Playground. Stagecoach Race, Sumas Roundup.
This is a present-day picture of the 1932 Customs Building, which was a modified Dutch colonial design. It was moved in the 1990 to make room for the new custom buildings at the border. It was moved because of the Vox Swift, and it was moved nearby southeast of where it originally stood. During the process of it being moved, there was a flood, and so they had to stop until the water receded.